Just wait a moment.
So in my last build video, I went over an incredibly strong Tornado Druid build that was a bit more focused on mobbing, so doing Hell Tides, Nightmare Dungeons, and doing the pit up until the first boss. It was still decent for bosses, but with only a handful of changes, we can turn that build into a build that is much more focused for killing bosses and is incredibly good for killing bosses. Now the first big change is the mobbing version of this build. You need 4 uniques. For the bossing version, you only need 3, and one of them you don't really need. You probably wouldn't see a big difference if you didn't have it. Starting with Tempest Roar, you absolutely need this. Then you have Tybalt Will. This will just give you pretty big damage increases anytime you can become unstoppable. And then you have Wild Heart Hunger, which is more damage increases, but Wild Heart Hunger boots aren't really needed for the bossing version of this build. It's going to give you some decent damage increase, but if you don't have these, you probably won't notice the biggest of difference between having them and not having them. And then starting with our skill tree, you're just putting 2 points into any basic skills. You're not actually going to be using those. Then 5 into Tornado, our main damaging ability. Upgrade 1 has a chance to spawn additional tornadoes. Upgrade 2 has a chance to make enemies vulnerable, which is the main way we make enemies vulnerable. Then we're going all the way down and we're getting our companion skills. We're getting Wolves, we're getting Poison Creeper, we're getting Ravens. For Poison Creeper, you want Upgrade 1, which increases the immobilization effect. Upgrade 2 gives us increased critical strike chance against enemies hit by this, which is the main reason we're taking it. Then for Ravens, Upgrade 1 gives increased critical strike chance when the Ravens hit something. And then Upgrade 2, you get additional Ravens, which is primarily for scaling our damage. Then we're going to be using Trample primarily for the unstoppable. Upgrade 1 makes it do more damage against less targets, so it's actually decent damage against bosses. And then Natural Trample that gives us a big chunk of Fortify. And then our final ability is going to be changed up to Petrify. Now specifically when you're using this against bosses, it makes them take massively increased critical strike damage and the duration is increased. Upgrade 1 generates you Spirit. You really don't care about that part in this build too much, but the effect duration is increased. And then Upgrade 2, when you hit a boss, it reduces its cooldown, so you can have this up a bit more of the time. And then we have our passive, starting with Heart of the Wild to get 3 into Wild Impulse. Your core skills cost more, but deal more damage. 3 into Predatory Instinct for increased crit strike chance. Then 3 into increased movement speed while in Werewolf. 3 into Ancestral Fortitude for increased resistances. Now I've taken 3 points out of Vigilance because we don't have a defensive with this version of the build, and I put them into Nature's Reach. Now we don't have a ton of areas to put these points into. That's super helpful, but Nature's Reach gives you increased damage to distant enemies. Now normally with this build, you want to be close, but when you get to doing a lot of the more endgame bosses, more specifically tormented bosses, there are times in most of these boss fights that you have to run away from the boss specifically to dodge mechanics, and your tornadoes will still stay there spinning a bit when you're running around dodging mechanics, so this will just deal some increased damage. Then we have 1 into Elemental Exposure, just another lucky hit chance to make enemies vulnerable. Then we're going down 1 into Neurotoxin so we can get Toxic Claws. Crit strikes with your werewolf skills poison the enemy. We only care that they are poisoned. For Envenom, you deal increased critical strike damage to poison enemies. Then we have 3 into Defiance. Nature skills do increased damage to elites. This does work on bosses. Then we have Circle of Life. Nature skills that consume Spirit heal you for 3% of your max life. Every tornado heals us. 3 into Quick Shift. When you shapeshift into a new animal form, you gain increased damage stacking up. 3 into Heightened Senses. When you shapeshift into an animal form, you gain damage reduction while in Werebear, movement speed while in Werewolf. Then 1 into Natural Fortitude. Whenever you shapeshift, you fortify yourself for a bit for some extra fortification. And then finally for our capstone, we have Bestial Rampage. After you're in Werewolf for 2 seconds, 30% increased attack speed. After in Werebear for 2 seconds, you gain 50% multiplicative damage increase for 15. Now the main way you have to proc this in this build is you use Trample, you wait 2 seconds while in Werebear, and then you start damaging. A little bit weird, but the damage increases from this are absurd. Now you can also change off Bestial Rampage and go Urzine Strength. This will give you increased max life every time you use your Rampage, but you'll also just get 30% multiplicative damage increase while healthy. This is going to be a lot less damage. It's going to be a bit tankier for a portion of the fight, but generally I would still recommend Bestial Rampage and just learning how to get that Werebear buff. And then we have our Spirit Boons. Weariness take reduced damage from elites, Iron Feather for increased max life, and Avian Wraith for increased crit strike damage. And then we have Energize, another lucky hit. Dealing damage is a chance to restore some of your spirit. And then finally we have Masochistic, another lucky hit. Shapeshifting skills have a chance to heal you for 5% of your max life. Now in a lot of these endgame bosses, we don't necessarily need the additional healing from this, because a lot of these bosses, if you get hit by something that's going to kill you, it's pretty much going to insta kill you. So you can change to Calm Before the Storm, which is a a lucky hit to reduce the cooldown of your ultimate. If you want to do that, that can give you a lot more damage because you can petrify a lot more, or if you just think you need the survivability, stick with masochistic. Now, if you saw my last version of this build, the Paragon boards are pretty much unchanged, and that's for two reasons. One, you don't really need to change much to be better specifically against bosses. There's not much that's conditional in that way, but another reason is I want this version of the build to be very similar to the other one. You just need to make a handful of changes and you can be much stronger specifically for bosses. I want to keep it that way so you don't have to change up everything to have a better version of the build for bossing. So starting off, we have the werewolf glyph, increased damage while in werewolf, damage reduction while in werewolf. The first board we're taking is ancestral guidance. After spending 75 spirit, deal massively increased damage. The glyph we're taking is earth and sky. This buffs some magic nodes within range, and then nature skills deal increased damage to vulnerable or crowd controlled enemies. We get some core damage, some resistances, some additional intelligence or dexterity if you need those. Then we're going over to the right. We're taking the inner beast board, but we're not taking the node itself. The glyph we're taking is Fang and Claw, another bonus to magic nodes within range. Then while in werewolf or werebear, close enemies take more damage from you, get some shape-shifting damage, some armor, some more stats. Then we're going up. We're taking the Thunderstruck board. Storm skills deal increased damage equal to 20% of your damage versus close or damage versus distant. It's currently at 129%, so absolutely massive damage increase. And then the glyph we're taking is Outmatch, a bonus to all rare nodes within range, and then you deal increased physical damage to non-elites and bosses. So we'll get some damage reduction from vulnerable enemies, some storm skill damage, and some more stats if you need those. Then we're going back down, going over to the left, going up. We're taking the Constricting Tendrils board. The glyph we're taking is Territorial, increased damage to close enemies, damage reduction from close enemies. And then finally, we're going over to the left. We're taking the Lust for Carnage board, and we are actually taking Lust for Carnage. Critical strikes with werewolf skills restore 2 spirit. This is actually very good for bosses because you're throwing out dozens of tornadoes, all of them just spinning around, constantly hitting. Every single time one of those crits, it gives you 2 spirit. Multiply that by a bunch, and you really don't have to worry about spirit. And then the glyph we're taking is Spirit. Increased critical strike damage. Critical strikes against an enemy make them take increased damage from you, stacking up to 12%. And just like I mentioned in my last video, make sure when going through Paragon boards, you get yourself to resistance cap. And if you need more armor, you get more armor. Like compared to a lot of other Paragon boards for Tornado Druids, I go up and use some few points to get these lightning resistance nodes because I needed more lightning resistance. This is massive for survivability, but if you have good lightning resistance and you don't need this, you can remove these and put them somewhere else. So make sure you're getting those defensives capped. And that brings us to our gear, starting with our gems. In your weapon, you want critical strike damage. In your gear, you want max life. And in your jewelry, you want whatever gems is going to allow you to cap your resistances. So you want to make sure you have all of your resistances capped. If you don't need one of these gems because you already have the resistances, make sure your armor is capped. It's like 9230 or something like that. And then past that, use whatever you want. You're probably going to need them for resistances. And then we have our uniques. Tempest Roar, the main thing you need. It's a lucky hit. Storm skills have up to a 25% chance to grant 4 spirit, can help with spirit regen, but the main reason we're taking this, your base storm skills are now also werewolf skills, scales a lot of our damage. Then we have Tybalt's Will. You gain massively increased damage after being unstoppable in 5 seconds after, and when you become unstoppable, you gain 50 of your primary resource. So anytime we use trample, we gain a big damage buff and some primary resource. This is primarily for boss killing, and for this version of the build, it's primarily for damage. You also do get the pretty good roll of damage reduction from close enemies, which you can't get on legendary gear pieces anymore, so this is actually pretty good for defensives as well. And then Wild Heart Hunger. When you shapeshift into werebear or werewolf, you gain Wild Heart for 5 seconds. This gives you a multiplicative damage increase, stacks up to 20 times. And like I mentioned, you can just have these as legendary boots. You'll do less damage, but not a massive amount of less damage because we're not shapeshifting back and forth as much as we would in the other version of this build. Now, one of the biggest changes with this has been not using the Hunter Zenith, which this is one of the main components of the mobbing version of the build because this is based off kills in werewolf. You don't do that as consistently on bosses. So the main thing you're switching this out with is a legendary ring with resource cost reduction, both in the rolls from the dropped item and the tempering roll. So as you see on both of these items, I have a dropped roll of resource cost reduction and a tempering roll. This is massive resource cost reduction, and this is what you need on boss fights. You never want to be out of spirit when on one of these endgame bosses, and having these rings is a big way in how you're going to be doing that. But that brings us to our legendary aspects. On your two-handed weapon, you want Core and grass skills deal an additional 20% multiplicative damage per companion you have. And we have 3 wolves, 2 poison creepers, and 4 ravens. Every single one of those gives us that damage increase, one of the biggest damage scalers of this entire build. On your necklace, your core skills deal up to 45% increased damage based on your fortify. This is multiplicative. Now, you're not going to have as much fortify in this version of the build. You should still have a bit, so this is still going to be pretty massive damage increases. And then on our rings, you want gain 1 additional companion. In addition, your companions deal more damage. This is primarily for the more companions for the scaling of our weapon enchant. And then our other ring, critical strikes with core skills, increase your attack speed by 25% for 5 seconds. This is just 25% increased attack speed for your tornadoes. You could spam out more tornadoes, a lot more damage. Then on our gloves, tornadoes will seek up to 3 targets. Now, this is actually something you may be able to change off if you don't care about changing your build even more, because you don't really need the tornadoes to track as much. In certain boss fights, you actually do want this, but some you may not need this. You could change this to something else and get some more damage if you wanted to do that. Then on our chest piece, gain damage reduction while in werewolf, just for some more damage reduction. Now, if you're having issues getting to your armor cap, disobedience may be better on your chest because the armor cap is actually very important. And like with all my builds, there will be a build planner in the description where you can go check out all of the stats on any of these pieces of gear. The most important stats are still going to be the resource cost reduction on your weapon, the tempering stat for chance for tornadoes to cast twice on your weapon, and then the resource cost reduction on your rings. Those are the most important stats you're going to need for this build. Now, on top of that, if you're feeling like you're still running out of spirit when on a boss fight, use the elixir of resourcefulness. This grants you 20% resource cost reduction. This is absurd. This is absolutely massive. This gives almost as much as you can get on a singular ring of resource cost reduction. So that's huge. If you have these rings with the resource cost reduction, you have it on your weapon, and you have this elixir, you should have no issues with ever having max spirit while on a boss fight. But that's the entirety of this build. This build is incredibly strong for boss fights. It's much stronger than the mobbing version of this build, with only changing a few options. The primary things you're actually changing are changing to petrify and then changing one of your rings. You're not changing a ton past that, and it massively increases the power of this build versus bosses. You can go solo all the tormented bosses you want. You should be able to go do Uber Lilith as well. This should allow you to do any endgame boss currently in the game. But that's pretty much all I'm going to go over, so thanks for watching.
I must wait a moment.